Hey guys, I'm back. So I'm all excited because chapter 6 really did upload like it was supposed to. Yay. We can thank Mrs. Yinks too because she came down to help me try to figure out what I did wrong the first time. So now we are on chapter 7. It's called Frank and Me. So I'm guessing Frank is the name of that new friend that he meets. So this will be an interesting chapter. This one I have not read yet. So you and I are both reading it for the first time. Chapter 7, Frank and Me. After my friend Cousins died, I spent more and more time nosing around the camp for food. The men were starving and mostly couldn't share. Then one day in August 1942, I passed a man in the eating area. I had seen him around, but we hadn't really met yet. Frank Williams had the same tiny bit of rice that the rest of the men had, but he could see I was hungry. He poured some of the watery rice into his palm, into his hand. "Come on, Judy," he said, "this is yours." I whined. I knew Frank was starving, so I gave him a chance to change his mind. He didn't. Instead, he set his whole plate on the ground and petted me while I slurped it up. What a nice man. I settled in next to him. Underneath Frank's dirt and sweat, I could smell kindness and something else, a sense of adventure. I learned later that before he joined the RAF, the Royal Air Force, so Frank is in the Air Force, Frank had been a merchant marine, sailing on ships that carried goods to ports around the world. Frank and I had both gone to sea in search of friendship and adventure. Maybe that's why we became such good friends. It wasn't long before I knew I was meant to be Frank's dog, and he was meant to be my human. He knew it too. From then on, we were inseparable, and we kept each other alive. One of our first adventures together involved coming up with a great plan for stealing food from the temple grounds, where the Japanese guards left fruit at the shrine. While Frank worked, I hid in a bush and listened for his whistle. When the coast was clear, I dashed to the shrine, grabbed the fruit, and ran back into the bush. At the end of Frank's workday, we shared our feast hidden in the jungle. Frank taught me lots of things. I knew that when he snapped his fingers a certain way, I had to hide from the guards and not come back out until he snapped again. We also did tricks for the other POWs to keep their spirits up. POWs stands for prisoners of war. I could do all the usual things like sit and roll over, but Frank also taught me how to hide on command. I'd slip under his bunk and then reappear at the other end of the barracks before anyone even knew I was gone. The men loved it. I continued to hunt at night, and I brought Frank everything I caught and killed so we could share. On one of my nighttime treks into the jungle, I met a nice dog, and we spent some time together. And boy, was Frank surprised when he discovered I was going to have more puppies. On November 18th, 1942, they were born, 5 of them. I didn't know it then, but Frank and one of my puppies would save my life and help me make military history. So that's a little bit of foreshadowing. It's letting us know something's going to happen, but we don't know exactly what. So they call that foreshadowing. Colonel Bano, like the other Japanese soldiers in camp, didn't like dogs. As rations got smaller and smaller, even for them, I began to think they were looking at me like I was their next dinner. But he had a local lady friend who loved me. Whenever she came to camp, she called me to her. As long as Bano wasn't standing right next to her, I was happy to visit because she always slipped me a treat. One day, Frank figured out that Bano would be leaving camp to visit his girlfriend, and that's when he came up with his plan. He hid in the bushes with one of my pups, Kish, the cutest one, and carried him into Bano's quarters. That alone was enough to get Frank shot. But when Kish waddled across the colonel's desk, Bano burst out laughing. Frank used sign language to suggest that Bano give Kish to his girlfriend as a present, and Bano loved the idea. Then Frank got to his real request. He told the colonel how important I was to morale, how much harder the men worked when I was around, and how the guards threatened to shoot me on a regular basis. "If you make Judy a prisoner of war, she'll be protected," Frank said. Bano said he couldn't. Japanese records were very precise. How would he explain an extra prisoner in camp? Add the letter A to my number, Frank suggested. Judy can be prisoner 81A. No need for records. Kish was not only cute, he was smart too. At that moment, he did a somersault on the colonel's desk. Smiling, the colonel agreed. He wrote out an official order for Frank to keep in his pocket, one that named me a prisoner of war. The men in the barracks made a tag for my collar out of a piece of old tin. 81A, Glogauer Medan. I was official. The guards couldn't threaten to shoot me anymore, and I'd get to stay with Frank. That's really smart. So now Judy is a little bit more safe. I hated saying goodbye to Kish, but he was going to a good person who loved dogs. My other pups found new homes too. A secret request for a puppy came from the woman's POW camp, and a local fruit seller smuggled Shikji to them in her basket. So the prisoner of war camp for women is now going to get one of the puppies. So now they both will have dogs. Rokook snuck through a drainage pipe so she could go to the Swiss consulate in Medan. And Punch and Jackie stayed in camp for as long as they could, but one day they escaped into the jungle. They had inherited my love of adventure. I hope they'd inherited my survival skills too. Things went okay after that. We were starving, but we survived. Then in April 1943, Bano left and a new officer took over, Captain Nishi. He was the meanest one yet. On his first day, Nishi had the men assemble in the yard and stand at attention, which is standing up straight and listening. Even the men who were sick had to go out there. I followed orders and stood at Frank's side. Nishi took one look at me and stormed over, slapping his cane against his boot. I was scared, but I was mad too, and I started to growl. Frank pulled out the paper that made me an official POW. That made Nishi even angrier. But Bano was a colonel, and he was just a captain, so he couldn't give the order to kill me, at least not yet. So Bano, who said that he was a prisoner of war, had a higher rank and was more important in the army than this new Nishi. He forced the men to work, taking apart an old factory until they could hardly stand, and then prodded them to work some more. Those who couldn't were badly beaten, so once they got super tired and couldn't work anymore, they were beaten. Then Nishi made an announcement. According to the Imperial High Command, all prisoners are ordered to Singapore. There was relief and even a little hope in the air. Singapore meant civilization and maybe news about how the war was really going. It might mean letters from home or even Red Cross packages. Best of all, it meant no more jungle. So they're going to head back to Singapore. Red Cross packages are packages of sometimes food, different things that are sent to them. Frank was packing up his few belongings back in the barracks when Nishi stormed in. Frank snapped his fingers and I slipped under the bunk out of sight. "Dog not go," Nishi shouted. "Dog stay." As he strode out, the men saw a smile flit across his face. My friend slumped on his bunk, devastated. I crept out and licked his hand. "I won't leave you behind, girl," he said, ruffling my ears. For the next few hours, we practiced a new trick. Frank would snap his fingers and I'd run into the rice sack at his feet. The next time he snapped, I'd run out again and dash for cover. We did that over and over and over again. So Frank's trying to figure out a way to train Judy so she can stay safe and sneak on board with them. After I had that trick down, Frank practiced standing with me in the sack while it hung over his shoulder. I had to stay very still and not give myself away. It was hot and dark and uncomfortable, but if that's what it took for Frank and me to stay together, that's what I'd do. At dawn the next day, we were called to the yard. The line of sick and wounded was as long as the men who were considered healthy. If starving could still be healthy. Under Nishi's mean eyes, Frank tied me to a pole with a long rope. "Now you stay right here, girl," he said. So he's trying to make it look like she's like a bag of something. I licked his hand. I knew what those words were really meant. Join me as soon as the coast is clear. Oh, I was wrong there. So she's staying on the ground right now. Frank stood with the others, a rice sack holding a blanket at his feet. Nishi checked his bag personally and then looked over Frank's shoulder and gave me a cruel smile. "Move," he shouted to the men. "March." The POWs hobbled toward the gates. Frank was near the end of the line, and I watched him carefully, waiting for the signal. He had just cleared the gates when he whistled. I slipped from my knot and dashed into the jungle lining the road. I stayed out of sight until Frank was at the train station ready to board. So this dog's very smart. She knew to follow Frank, but to not be seen. Frank knelt down to tie his shoe and handed the blanket in his rice sack to another man. The prisoners formed a circle around him, and then Frank snapped his fingers. I was in the sack in seconds, and we stepped onto the train. Pretty sneaky. When we reached the port city, Frank gave me the signal to hide. I hid in the only place I could think of, under the train. Then, as the prisoners were lined up and marched toward the port, I followed from whatever cover I could find. When Frank's rice sack was checked, the guards found it filled with a blanket just like in camp. The men were lined up to board the ship when I made my next move. I slithered on my belly like a snake in the jungle, freezing and flattening whenever a guard neared, so she'd get really still. Finally, I made my way into the row of prisoners and toward my friend. Frank dumped the blanket, and once again I jumped into his sack. I was safe, but we had to stand for hours in the hot sun while we waited for the ship's gangway to be readied. I could feel Frank's legs swaying and buckling, but the men around him helped prop him up and keep him standing, because remember, he's also holding the dog in the sack, so it's getting heavy after all those hours of standing. I kept perfectly still, just like I had been trained. The hardest part was when I smelled Captain Nishi approach my friend and heard his mean voice. Has he found us out? I wondered. It was all I could do not to growl at him and show my teeth. Dog no come? He demanded. Dog no come, Frank said. Even from inside the sack, I could sense the captain's evil joy as he strode away. We made it this far. Now all we had to do was survive the ship crossing, and we'd be in Singapore together. So she managed to sneak on board and make it with Frank. So pretty exciting so far. That's the end of chapter 7. Talk to you guys later. Hope everything's going well.